Our next speaker once choreographed an entire musical that friends of hers wrote and composed. Please welcome Anna.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Anna. I'm going to talk to you about my journey through trying to get to know ChatGPT and what to do with it, and using colorful queries. Spoiler alert, I'm a little bit obsessed with colors, so you'll see a lot of that today. We'll start. Just a friendly disclaimer, this is my personal kind of like playing around with things, just exploring and kind of figuring out what to do. Okay, let's start. We have LLMs, we have ChatGPT, we have all sorts of this crazy, new, fancy, shiny thing. And like my first introduction to that went a little bit off the rails. There were a lot of like webcasts and posts and news and discussions and like everything. And then I heard a comment in one of those situations where someone said, in my entire life of like my 40-year career, I never had to code. And now I code in Python. And my heart dropped and was like, that may not be the best idea. There are some learnings that you learn when you learn how to properly code and try to debug things and like take it slow and things like that. So maybe not the best. So I started playing around and kind of like asking all of my colleagues and friends of like, what do you do with this? And kind of like, I plan a birthday party. I use it for traveling, conversations, email hacking, not hacking, like rewriting things. And I'm definitely one of those people kind of rewriting all the emails all day long. So it sounds like a good idea. However, when I try to kind of use simple code snippets, what I do on a daily basis, I spend an hour correcting 5 errors in a code snippet of like 5 lines. I was like, well, I could have rewritten this in like 10 seconds myself, so didn't really see kind of the point. I want to say ChatGPT was really friendly about kind of like admitting its errors. That was a plus. Debugging, also, I haven't quite figured out what really kind of to write to kind of help me with that yet. Very early on, I'd gotten a little bit better at it. I used it for crocheting patterns. For anyone who doesn't know what that is, it is knitting, but with like 1 hook instead 2 needles. Also did not go great. It stopped in the middle of the pattern. I was like, you're not done. It's like, maybe didn't know how to finish. Like usually at the end of patterns, you fasten off or you kind of like do a final knot, so it should be visible in the language, but maybe it's not. Travel itineraries, that surprisingly worked really well, so that was good. Then, of course, you only travel that often, so. Format instructions, that was fun. Also, with mixed results, but great invention. A couple observations. Again, it was really nice about like admitting its errors. That went well. One might call it like creative freedom or like fashion to have like a half-knitted sweater or like with only 1 sleeves. So that's fine. Let's call it creativity. But what that led to is just like a lot of more questions of like, how do you write the proper query? How do you kind of like write a good prompt? How do you write the right prompt? And so on and so forth. Oh, OK. Then I got into like the refresh button, kind of like reloading the answer of like, and kind of see how reliable is the answer. And though I noticed that sometimes the words may be slightly different, the sentiment kind of like was conveyed like in a rather robust way as far as I could tell. And then kind of like coming from the perspective of creativity and kind of like all the kind of arts and kind of images generation and kind of storytelling and stuff like how creative can it be and like what does creativity actually mean to a model and things like that. So I decided I need to understand a little bit more. And this really is kind of the only suitable answer at this moment is like, let's dive into this a little bit more. And so I had this funny idea to figure out, like, sentiment, consistency, robustness, so to say, in like the user sense, not the modeling sense. I want to be very clear about that. Of that, ChatGPT, LLM, whatever. OK, so let's use colors because they're fun and I'm obsessed with them. Also, like I asked myself a couple of questions. Can ChatGPT categorize hex codes into a predefined set of main color categories? I wanted to explore the intersection of like hex codes, which is something like rather standardized, with kind of the notion of giving a context, like setting constraints, so to say, and the intersection of language. Like colors are very, very culturally specific. It depends what language you speak. You have a slightly different perception of colors. For example, I think in the Russian language, there is a specific word for light blue and a specific word for dark blue. And so people claim they can see different shades of blue a little bit better if they grew up speaking Russian. I've heard. I haven't confirmed it yet. Or like just from like a historical perspective, the name orange for the color orange. So the color orange didn't exist until kind of like we discovered America, the Americas, and kind of like oranges became a thing, and so on and so forth. That being said, sounds like a fun idea. I wanted to see how consistent are the answer, mostly in the sentiment. Like I don't really want to know, like, do I get the same words all the time? I just wanted to see is the general meaning conveyed over time, in multiple times, same way. Can it understand the instructions? That was kind of one of the things that I noticed very early on, especially when I tried to kind of ask it for a simple plot and kind of correcting its errors all over again. At the end, it forgot what the actual task was. So it's like, OK, the attention span is not that fun. Maybe it needs to grow a little bit. And then, right, coming back to the language part is like one of my favorite things with colors is coming up with proverbs, coming up with idioms. They're also very language and cultural specific. And so kind of like figuring out if ChatGPT can be creative about that and kind of leverage different settings from here and there would be fun to analyze. OK. I talked a lot about this. I'll repeat once again, why colors? I'm obsessed with them. But like the cultural context is really interesting for me, kind of like seeing what that means and how that would translate into something like ChatGPT. Language specific. Colors have a scientific representation or interpretation. So that is something where kind of like my coding brain comes in a little bit, so helpful. And then just like various other reasons. If one is interested in learning more about this, I have 2 book recommendations that I highly recommend. One is On Color, that kind of talks about this kind of cultural language-specific aspect. And this one is, I think, my favorite. It's like The Secret Lives of Colors, where we talk about like, right, the color orange, for example, where that came from, and like different chemical aspects historically that were available for colors that kind of introduced new words, new colors, and new kind of art themes, and so on and so forth. But let's start getting into the details here. I'm running out of time. R and OpenAI. Someone wrote a package. Thank you very much. It's very easy kind of setting this up. I really kind of appreciate the kind of accessibility of that. So I wrote a little bit of a message. I wrote a connection and kind of like figuring out what to do. And this is where the temperature comes in. I wanted to introduce randomness. So the temperature parameter controls for the temperature, and the randomness, or so to say, the creativity of the model. Lower temperature, more deterministic, more reliable maybe, more robust. Higher temperatures, more random, more creative, more diverse. OK. From like a stats perspective, I want to predict what's the next most likely word, right? So I came up with this: cloudy with a chance of rain, or maybe meatballs. If anyone is interested, the bottom left is called Fleischbällchen, which is meatballs in German. Could be an option. Higher temperatures kind of like smooth out the probability, kind of like so that words that you may not think about using next become a little bit more likely to be selected, and so on and so forth. Lower temperatures kind of like follow the distribution. OK, so quickly going over what I used here. I wanted to write a message list to give my chat completion I have a bunch of different temperature parameters that I wanted to test, and I asked it to categorize color in those 7 main color categories. And you'll note that orange, for example, is not one of them on purpose. I read a study once, or like the summary of a study, where people wanted to analyze if like toddlers who cannot yet speak, kind of how they would categorize colors, and they discovered somehow that babies can categorize colors in those 7 color categories. Thought like, let's use that. So this is what we have. A little bit of an interesting observation is I ran into some limit constraints. So there is, when you sign up for the API with ChatGPT and OpenAI, there are some limits of like how many tokens per day, per minute, how many requests per day you can send. So kind of like my go-to of like, let's use all the colors, run this 150 times at least to get some like reliable results that we can analyze. I ran into some like constraints rather quickly. So like some quick maths, if I wanted to use 405 colors, which is like roughly kind of all the named colors in R, with like kicking out a lot of the grays. My query kind of, on average, ran up to like 60 between 80 tokens per request. If I wanted to kind of do this with 9 different color temperature settings, I get to roughly 300,000 tokens. It is rather quick, so it runs in definitely less than a minute. So I ran into the 60K tokens per limit constraint rather quickly, and I discovered a wonderful function. I rediscovered a wonderful function, the system.sleep. Helps really well. It just prolonged a little bit the analysis and kind of the data generation of that. But that being said, it went really well. So let's look at the results. So what I'm going to show you is like I selected, I think, 45 colors at the end that sounded interesting, and then just looked at, okay, what is the main color category that ChatGPT chose for that specific code, given to ChatGPT by its hex code. That is important, not by its color name, because they are very subjective, but by its hex code. Okay, this is what it looks like. So you'll see color-coded for different temperature settings. Note I have only 2 lower temperature settings and 4 higher temperature settings, and so on and so forth. It had anything that is grayed out is either an error or a wrong color or the color gray, actually. Because a lot of the grays it wanted to call gray, which I appreciated, but right again, I gave it specific instructions to not do that, or like find another way. So I would have been fine with black and white, but it didn't like it. Fine. A couple of interesting things that surprised me are cyan is mostly white. Interesting. But like just going to like kind of the raw colors, what we can see here is that, right, with higher temperature settings, it wanted to categorize us in a different color. So kind of we can see the notion of higher temperatures to kind of being more creative, in the sense of like it might not necessarily be scientifically true that red should be categorized as purple, but it's not that far off either. And right, this is kind of like my trying to understand like what does creativity or like diversity for ChatGPT or like an LLM actually mean. As I said, cyan, it surprised me a little bit that it was mostly white. Is that visible? It is supposed to be white. Everything that is not visible is white. It got to kind of like the blue eventually, so I was fine with that. The green and the yellow also interesting. It had a lot of troubles with the grays. And like any sort of like colors that if you kind of put all your watercolors into one pot, it would be brown, right? It's kind of like if you put all the colors, it detected all the colors. That was nice. Again, right? I'm not trying to reclassify colors here. I'm just trying to understand from like a language perspective what would ChatGPT do. Okay. The instructions were sometimes very well followed, sometimes really not. And so only with like higher temperature settings, I also got a lot of like reasoning. With higher temperature settings, the responses tended to be a little bit longer as well. And so, for example, for the color khaki, it kind of, right, it's like, this is my hex code, and within my standard categories of like my 7 colors, this would be green. Great, you understood my instructions, you repeated them to me, wonderful. Misty Rose, for example, it would be categorized as pink, but I don't have that color category, let's call it red, because it's a reddish hue. Awesome. With lower temperature settings, totally ignored my color categories, totally ignored my instructions most of the time, and just named the color whatever they wanted. Still fine, right? Another example, with higher temperature settings, you run into some Unix code errors. Also, emojis apparently is a thing now. Sometimes I get weird, like it gave me a little square of the actual color, so like a little bit of an image. It was nice as well. But yeah, a little bit more gibberish and kind of like, where is the, oh, you can't see it. Yeah, the mandarin was very interesting to me, like a mandarin, right? It could be an orange, so with dark orange, that was interesting. But yeah, that was definitely interesting. Good. Let's get to proverbs or idioms. One of my favorite things, again, in German is dasselbe in grün, which means same but different, the same thing but in green. I tend to use it rather frequently these days, and everyone is very confused. So I'm explaining it to you so I can use it today. What I wanted to do is give ChatGPT a color, let it come up with an idiom or a saying or a phrase or a metaphor, if you so will, and then interpret the symbolism on top of that. So what that means is I need to kind of send a request, get the response back, send the request again, and get the symbolism out of it. Right? Again, trying to explore creativity, also kind of the intersection of code or like something scientific like colors with the language part on top of that. Okay, and if the symbolism changes, right, kind of getting to understand if like the general message, kind of like how robust or like how consistent that would be with different temperature settings. This is roughly what the query looked like. I had to a little, kind of for formatting issues, there are some things in here that may not make sense, but should work. But this is kind of like, hoopla, the highlight in the middle of like getting the response first, then sending it again. Yeah, and this is what it kind of like then did for like blue, right? Cornflower blue, we're kind of like a calming presence. Anything that is in red is higher temperature setting. Anything that is blue is lower temperature settings, like hot and cold. And green is in the middle. Green is actually often associated with like envy, if that's surprising. Yellow was very interesting. It was mostly associated with age, kind of like aging, like yellow pages, not like yellow pages, like old pages, apparently. Red, joy and anger, very kind of like interesting. The sophistication of like an eggplant color, aubergine, was also very interesting to kind of see. What I noticed though is a lot of the times it wanted to paint the town with something. So a lot of the idioms I got back is like, paint the town like purple, paint the town aubergine, with different meanings. It interpreted in different ways. So that was interesting. Like, can I go to the right here actually? Probably not. But on the right-hand side of this table, you see that not for every single temperature, it kind of selected this idiom for all the colors, but only a subset. So that was interesting to see. And like 25% of the idioms I got back were like paint the town something. And most of them were coming actually from the higher temperature setting. But then also, what I got back are like, when the chips are down, it always helps to have a friend who's true blue instead of two-faced brown. I have no idea what that means. ChatGPT did not either. Keeping things cocky, like that, it's supposed to be very bland and very kind of like relaxed. I'm gonna use that for sure. The last thing, like, aren't you glad to see the sunshine after the storm? Interesting language pun, so I appreciated that. Happened only with high temperature settings. With lower temperature settings, I got a lot of like feeling blue, feeling like kind of the skies are gray, painting the town, something. But yeah, so where does that leave me? What to do with this? So in conclusion, communication is key. So yes, I understand, because I ask ChatGPT sometimes, like, do you understand my instructions? Like, please repeat them to me. If it is an affirmative, it does not necessarily mean that it's actually true. I also found that when talking to people, that might be the case. A lot of times when you're kind of communicating or talking, right, there is a lot of like assumptions, there's a lot of like context that you may think that you're conveying with the words that you're speaking, but that may not necessarily translate or reach the other person. So I've had a lot of times kind of working with different sorts of people who kind of like told me, yes, I understand, and then we kept working together, and I was like, maybe you did not. So that was interesting that with ChatGPT that could also be true. The context matters in the sense of like my prompt, my query, like in this context of like where, in what field I'm kind of operating in, does matter. And I found that, right, with like ChatGPT, for example, if I compared those queries that I ran with the API, if I put them in ChatGPT, it's slightly different. It's much more conversational. So the underlying models are trained very much for specific things, which brings me to kind of like the creativity part of it. Of like, for me, creativity is very much like being able to apply all sorts of like fun things from a completely different field where I see some similarities to the task at hand. Also, by reading like a lot of the documentations, I'm very glad I have a SAS background. Because like, right, for example, the temperature parameter, the line just reads, it manipulates the kind of like distribution, probability distribution. Not all people know what that means. As I said, like kind of the creativity, still kind of like questionable what that really means for a model. And then especially with the crocheting part and kind of like things like that, I noticed like not everything is written down. A lot of that knowledge is very kind of communal and tribal. It differs from state to state, from country to country. It's very interesting. And so, right, why would ChatGPT really know like what that means if it's not written down properly anywhere? So a lot more questions, a lot more fun things to explore. In conclusion, or like to end this, really, I wanted to do one thing, which is, oh yeah, sleep is lovely. Whoever advocated to highlight colors in our studio, thank you so much. It's the best invention ever. Thank you.